In this module, we're going to move from the theory of value and start to look at what approaches we actually take to solving the practical valuation problem. And so this module is going to go through the different valuation approaches, and then it's going to go through in detail the steps involved in the comparable sales method. And to do that, at least to introduce it, I'll take you through a series of PowerPoints. The study guide is especially useful for this chapter or this module, but also the reading from the textbook, highly recommended. Let's move now to the presentation, the details. The first question to look at is how many values there are. Tom Whipple looked at half a dozen values that can be observed in any transaction, and they're listed up on this PowerPoint. I don't really need to go over them, they're in the study guide. The important thing is that in any transaction between two parties, there's more than one number floating around, and I'll let you look at those. Basically, the seller and the buyer, both being a bit on the greedy side, are going to be setting the numbers to suit themselves, and then eventually they're going to come down to an actual price. But then they'll walk away thinking, I wonder if I did sell it at the right price, should I have sold it a bit more or a little bit less? And so there's a distinction between the transaction price and the true value of the property. And there's this ongoing debate in the industry about what the true value of the property really is and whether there is one and how do you find it and things like that. We don't have to worry too much about that deep question at present. We want to look at the practical question of giving an estimate of what the property is likely to sell if it was brought to market in the near future, in the next few months, in a situation where there are willing but not too enthusiastic buyers and sellers. However, it's important to realise that we can look at value in a number of different ways. We can also look at values for different people. And so this question of value isn't quite as straightforward. However, for our purposes, we can resolve it at this level as simply being an estimate of what the property will sell for if it's brought to market in normal conditions in the immediate future. It turns out there are three major approaches to valuation. They all relate in different ways to taking evidence from the marketplace, what has sold recently. The most evident and the simplest of those is known as the comparable sales method. Whipple has a far more complicated name for it that you are welcome to look at. It's also known as the market approach or the sales approach. They all mean simply taking the property you're looking at and comparing it to other similar sales which have recently sold and saying, well, is this property a bit better than this one, a bit worse than that one? It should be in this price area. That's quite a simple method, and it's quite applicable to residential properties, and especially properties that don't earn an income. The second approach is known as the income approach. This is the approach which is better suited to any property which is owned with the purpose of earning an income, earning a rent. And so the income approach is that second common approach. The third major approach is known as the cost approach. The cost approach will be the topic of its own module, and we'll be looking at the advantages and disadvantages of it. It's basically the approach to valuation which adds together the value of the land plus the value of the improvements to give you the value of the property altogether. We will be arguing later on that this cost approach is in fact not quite as reliable as the other ones in most cases. There's lots of interesting theory behind that, but from a practical point of view, simply knowing that I've built a $200,000 house on a $100,000 block of land does not mean that I've got a property worth $300,000, but we'll be dealing with that later on. There is a fourth approach which is known as the residual land value. This is the approach which is particular to development land. We don't need to deal with it very much further here. There will be a separate module on it. And so there are four approaches overall: really 3 for most cases, and we have to decide which approach we're going to use in any particular case. On this table, we see that for different market types, for residential, commercial and so on properties, it's listed out the common approaches which are used as the primary method, that's with a P, or as a check method, which is a secondary approach, which is a C. Valuers always aim to defend their valuations by providing a valuation computed 2 ways. The primary approach, which is considered to be the most likely, the most reliable, and that's supported or checked by a secondary approach. These common approaches are set out here. It's important to know, though, that you don't always use these approaches as they're laid out on the table. It's important for the valuer to know when to change the approach, what approach to select. That leaves us on to the next question, is what considerations does the valuer have to take into account when deciding on how to value a particular property? And the considerations are dealt with in the study guide. Ultimately, the valuation purpose is very, very important. A bank looking for a mortgage valuation is going to be interested in a different approach or a different value, a different way of considering the property, say to an insurance company or an investor considering buying the property, or one of a number of other situations. And so the valuation purpose is important. Related to the valuation purpose is the highest and best use for the property, so that gives us an idea of how much flexibility there is in the property's future. It's generally assumed, as we've mentioned before, that the property is going to be used for its highest and best use, because in an auction room, the person who is likely to get the most out of the property is also the person who's willing to pay the most for it. And that's where we take into account this question of its rental potential, its productivity, to use Whipple's term. The third consideration, which is important, is the most probable buyer. If we know that there are overseas investors looking in the market, that's going to give us a different view of how the market's going to behave to if it's simply domestic owner-occupiers or somebody else. So the most probable buyer is an important consideration. And then move to the steps in the valuation process. These steps apply regardless of what approach or approaches you're going to take. However, in the module, we're going to be looking specifically at applying them in the situation of comparable sales. All valuations start off with instruction. These are important because they set up the relationship between the valuer and the client. The valuer needs to know exactly what the interest is that's going to be valued, what the property is as well, why the client wants the valuation done, what the purpose is, and that really gives the valuer an understanding of how to proceed. The next step I'm suggesting is the approach selection. In many cases, the valuer will have decided the approach pretty much immediately the instructions are received. In some cases, they might want to know a bit more about the property and the situation and collect some data before deciding on an approach. However, the more experienced valuers will tend to make the approach selection almost so quickly that you hardly notice it happening. The collection of data is important. It comes from a number of different sources and it consists of a number of different types. It relates to the property and to the market and to the economy in general, and that's detailed in more detail in the study guide. After collecting the data, the valuer moves out to inspect the property. Property inspection is not as important as a lot of people believe. Measuring up the property to the nearest millimetre is not important because you really have to get a general idea of the property in the same way that the market would evaluate the property. And so an idea of the floor area is very important, but also the condition of the property, what maintenance is necessary, what the type of construction materials and their finish is all important. However, in many property types, you find that because localities and local markets tend to perform fairly similarly, A valuer will usually have a general idea of what the property is going to be worth before they even get to the inspection, before they see the property. And so this gives rise to different approaches, and there's a certain amount of debate on the inspection. The inspection of property will be dealt with in its own module. The next stage in the valuation process is the analysis. This again depends on the approach which is taken. In the comparable sales approach, the analysis largely consists of a detailed comparison between the comparable sales, the similar recent sales, and the subject property. Lastly, all valuations end with a report, and that's where the valuer presents their findings in usually a written form, which becomes a document that can be sort of taken to court and defended. So that's the steps. For the comparable sales approach, as I said, the inspection is going to be dealt with in a separate module, the same as the collection of data. There's going to be more details as we go through the course. Let's look now, though, at the unique approach of comparable sales and how that's affected. One of the things about the comparable sales approach is that you seldom get two properties which are identical. And even if you were to get two properties that were built by the same builder in the same age and exactly the same floor plan or what have you, one would probably be on one side of the street and one with the other, or there'd be sort of slight differences. One might be down one end of the street where it's near a railway line, the other one might be near a nice park or something, or a shopping centre or a school or who knows what, and those things do push the value up or down. And so getting identical comparable sales is near to impossible. You simply don't expect it. What the valuer then has to do is develop the familiarity and the skills to be able to adjust the various differences between the comparables and the subject property. In the textbook, a lot of attention is given to what's known as the adjustment grid approach, and I invite you to read through that. Basically, this approach is where you look at each comparable sale and then you adjust its value for its differences to the subject property. If we look at the 2 Joseph Street property, we see that it's sold for $457,000, but there are differences between it and the subject property in terms of whether one has a garage and a pool and a different aspect. And so on the basis of the valuer's estimates of the values of these different contributions, the value is simply adjusted from the 457,000 by those adjustments, and it comes out at 444. By the time the other comparable sales are likewise adjusted, you end up with what appears to be quite a range of comparable sales prices being analysed down into a very narrow band, and that gives the valuer confidence that the subject property looks like it's between $444,000 and $449,000, and that's certainly a very nice result. There are a number of dangers with using the adjustment grid as though it was able to be applied with mathematical precision, and that comes from the fact that really putting a precise dollar number on something like the value of a pool or an aspect is ultimately rather subjective, and even if the valuer is quite experienced, that may not have been the way that the buyer of, let's say, 7 Mary Street behaved when they allocated value to the aspect. We've got $12,000 on aspect for Mary Street, we've got $5,000 on Joseph Street. They were different buyers, and they might have been having different things going through their heads. However, that's about the closest we can get to a sensible answer. The advantage of the adjustment grid, even though it shouldn't be taken as mathematically literal, is that it puts the valuer's thought processes down on paper, which makes it easy for them to defend them if it does come to a court case. It also means that they can come back to that valuation later on and, again, understand their thought processes. And so there's considerable advantages with the adjustment grid approach. However, it has to be used, like most things in valuation, with caution. I recommend that you read both the textbook and the study guide on the rest of the details, because you'll find that while it gives practical details, it's worth being aware that many aspects do need to be applied with care. It's appropriate now to go through the study guide and also read the chapter, because they're both very important for this module.